In the annals of the American Old West, there are tales of courage, tales of greed, and tales of swift justice delivered by a gunslinger's bullet. But there are other stories, darker and more terrifying. Stories whispered on the scorching winds that scour the canyons, passed down around fading campfires. This is not a tale of a legendary hero or a famed gunfight on a dusty street. This is a true story of betrayal, of survival, and of one of the most brutal forms of punishment ever devised in that unforgiving land. It is the story of a man condemned to a slow death, buried to his neck in the heart of the desert, left to face his fate under a merciless sky. This is the story of Jedidiah Cain, the man who came back from the grave. The sun was a disk of molten fire, dissolving over the Arizona horizon and painting the red rocks and golden sands in hues of blood and flame. Moving across this majestic, cruel landscape was a small posse of 4 riders. They were not soldiers or explorers, but men who lived on the edge of the law, phantoms haunted by their own names and deeds. The Cain Gang, as they were known, was infamous throughout the territory, not for its size, but for its audacity and ruthlessness. At their head rode Silas, Blackheart Cain, a tall, wiry man with eyes as cold as shards of ice in a burning desert. His face was a harsh map of scars and weathered lines, each telling a story of a fight won or a deal gone wrong. Silas was the mastermind, the unforgiving leader whose word was undisputed law. Beside him rode his younger brother, Jedidiah Cain. Jedidiah was different. He possessed his brother's strong build, but his eyes held a flicker of melancholy and thought, the shadow of a soul that had not yet been entirely extinguished. He had joined his brother after a family tragedy left them orphaned, and Silas had promised him the world was a cruel place, and the only way to survive was to be crueler still. For years, Jedidiah believed this lie, becoming his brother's right hand, his fastest gun, his loyal shadow. Behind them rode 2 other men, Dutch Schultz, a hulking, quiet German whose fists were as heavy as sledgehammers, and Snake Eye Sam, a wiry gambler whose eyes darted constantly, always looking for an angle or an escape. They were returning from their latest and most daring job, the robbery of a Wells Fargo train carrying a miner's payroll and silver bullion worth thousands of dollars. It had been a keen, swift, and lethal operation. They had left dead guards and a smoldering train in their wake, and in their saddlebags was a prize that would secure them a comfortable life for years. But wealth, like water in the desert, can be a deadly mirage. The group halted at a rocky outcrop to rest their horses. Silas lit a cigar, blowing smoke into the hot, still air. He stayed at the distant horizon and spoke in a gravelly voice. "We split the take at dawn. Then we each go our own way for a few months, till the dust settles." Dutch and Sam grunted in agreement. But Jedidiah remained silent, gazing at the horizon where the sun was slowly sinking. He wasn't thinking of the gold or the silver. He was thinking of another face, a face he had seen 2 weeks prior in a small town called Santa Rosa. A month before the train robbery, while they were planning the heist, Jedidiah had been sent on a reconnaissance mission to the town of Santa Rosa. His job was to map out the local bank, but he found something else entirely. He found Ilara, the blacksmith's daughter, a young woman with honey-colored eyes and dark hair that flowed like a waterfall. She didn't know who he was, and no one there asked. To her, he was just a quiet stranger who came to have his horse's shoe repaired. They talked for hours, and Jedidiah felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy, a sense of peace. Ilara spoke of simple dreams, of a garden she wanted to plant, of her wish to one day see the ocean. She spoke not of gold or power, but of life. For the first time in his life as an outlaw, Jedidiah saw a different path. A path that didn't require bloodshed or constant running. When he returned to the gang, he was a changed man. He participated in the planning, but his heart was elsewhere. The gold they were about to steal was no longer a symbol of freedom, but ticket out. a ticket to start a new life with Ilara. His plan was simple and reckless. After the loot was divided, he would take his share and ride straight for Santa Rosa. He would buy a small ranch, ask for her hand, and let the name Jed Cain die in the desert. It was a naive dream, but it was the only one he had. But Silas, with his piercing gaze, sensed the change in his brother. He saw him polishing his gun belt with less care, staring into space for hours. He saw him scribbling something on a scrap of paper, only to burn it quickly when someone approached. Suspicion, like a slow-acting poison, began to seep into Silas's mind. To him, the gang was everything. Loyalty wasn't a choice, it was a condition of survival. Any hint of betrayal was a death sentence. That night, while Jedidiah slept, Snake Eye Sam sidled up to Silas. "I saw him in Santa Rosa," he hissed in a venomous whisper. "Talking to the blacksmith's girl." His eyes weren't on the bank, Silas. They were on her. That was the spark that lit the fuse. For Silas, it wasn't just a woman. It was a weakness, a threat to everything they had built. He saw in his brother's dream a betrayal of him and of the harsh memory of their past. He decided he would teach Jedidiah one final, brutal lesson. There is no escape from the outlaw life. The only escape is the grave. When dawn broke, there was no division of the loot. Jedidiah awoke to the cold steel muzzle of Silas's revolver pressed against his face. Dutch and Sam stood behind him, the look of camaraderie gone from their eyes, replaced by the cold indifference of executioners. "What is this, Silas?" Jedidiah asked, his voice tight with disbelief and fear. Silas smiled, a cold, thin slash that didn't reach his eyes. "Always the dreamer, little brother. Dreamin' of getting out of a clean life. Weren't you?" He nodded towards the saddlebags heavy with gold. "You were going to take your share and run to that girl, weren't you? Leave us here to deal with the fallout." "I would never betray you," Jedidiah yelled. "I was only going to take my share. What's mine by right?" Silas let out a short, dry laugh. "You're right. The only right you have is what I give you. You've forgotten the first lesson I taught you. We are family. And this gang is our only family. And those who leave the family are cast out." Silas ordered Dutch and Sam to start digging. At first, Jedidiah didn't understand. Were they going to shoot him and bury him? That seemed too merciful for Silas. Then he saw the shape of the hole. It wasn't deep enough to be a grave, but rather a narrow vertical hole. The horrifying truth dawned on him in an instant that froze the blood in his veins. They forced him into the hole. It was so tight he couldn't move his arms. They began to shovel the dirt and sand back in around him. He felt the cold earth against his legs, then his waist, then his chest. He screamed and begged, not for his life, but appealing to his brother. "Silas, please, we're blood." Silas paused, shoveling, and looked him dead in the eye. His own were utterly devoid of emotion. "Blood can be washed away with dirt, Jed. You wanted a new life, didn't you? Well, the earth will give you a new birth. It will make you part of it." They continued to fill the hole until the dirt reached his neck. His entire body was entombed, held fast by the immense weight of the desert itself. Only his head remained above the surface, helpless, exposed. Silas stood before him, took out a small canteen, drank from it slowly, and then poured the remaining water onto the sand right in front of Jedidiah's face. "The sun will be your first companion, then the thirst, then the insects, and at night the coyotes will come to hear your stories." He leaned in close, his face inches from his brother's. He whispered coldly, "This is the punishment for a traitor. Not a quick bullet, but a slow death, to give you time to think on your sin. When you draw your last breath, remember that it was I who granted you this time." Then Silas turned, mounted his horse, and rode away with Dutch and Sam, taking all the gold with them. They left Jedidiah Cain alone, a human head protruding from the endless expanse of the desert floor. to face the horrors of a slow and agonizing death. The first few minutes passed in a state of shock and denial. Jedidiah screamed his brother's name, cursed him, begged him, but the only answer was the echo of his own voice, swallowed by the vast silence of the desert. Then, as the sun climbed higher, the real torture began. The sun transformed from a source of warmth into an instrument of torture. Its rays baked his skin, parched his throat, and made his eyes water. Sweat poured from his brow, mixed with dust, and formed a caking mud that clogged his pores. It felt as if his head were inside an oven. He tried to close his eyes, but even his eyelids felt sunburnt. As the hours wore on, the thirst set in. It wasn't just a dry mouth. It was a burning, scraping sensation that tore at his throat and made every breath an agony. He began to hallucinate cold rivers, deep wells. Even the dirty water Silas had poured onto the sand seemed like a priceless treasure. Then came the insects. Ants crawled over his face, exploring his ears and nostrils. Flies swarmed his eyes and mouth, drawn to the last vestiges of moisture. He could do nothing to brush them away. He was a prisoner in his own body, a prisoner in the earth, forced to endure every touch, every bite, every crawl. When the sun finally began to set, it brought a temporary reprieve from the heat, but introduced a new horror. The desert temperature plummeted, and a biting cold seeped through the packed earth into his body. He began to shiver uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. The ground that had been an oven by day had become an icy tomb by night. And in the darkness, the sounds of the desert awakened. He heard the yipping howls of coyotes in the distance, sounding closer and closer. He knew they could smell weakness, smell impending death. He imagined their fangs closing on his helpless face. The fear was a living thing, threatening to consume his sanity. In those moments of absolute despair, two things kept him alive. The first was the image of Elara. Whenever he felt his consciousness slipping away, he would conjure her face, the smile, the sound of her voice talking about her garden and the ocean. Her image became his anchor in a storm of madness. He was no longer fighting just for his life, but for the promise he'd made to himself, for the chance to see her again. His love, once a weakness in Silas's eyes, now became his strongest weapon. The second was rage. A pure, white-hot rage directed at his brother. Every pang of pain, every humiliation, every moment of terror was converted into fuel for his will to survive. He swore to himself that if he lived, he would not run. He would find Silas. And he wouldn't kill him quickly. He would make him understand the true meaning of suffering, the meaning of being left alone in the dark. In the middle of the night, with an unexpected swiftness, clouds gathered. Lightning split the distant horizon, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The first drops of rain began to fall. At first, it was a blessing. Cool drops on his scorched face, washing away the dust, providing precious moisture for his cracked lips. He opened his mouth, trying to catch every drop as if it were the elixir of life. But the rain soon turned into a violent storm, a flash flood common in the Arizona desert. The parched earth turned to liquid mud. Jedidiah felt the dirt around him begin to shift, to soften. Cold water was seeping into this sandy grave, surrounding his body, loosening the earth's grip. It was a moment both terrifying and hopeful. The water threatened to drown him in his own muddy tomb, but at the same time, it was setting him free. Using every last ounce of his strength, he began to work his shoulders and neck, fighting against the liquefying mud. It was agonizing, slow work, but he could feel the earthen prison beginning to give way. After what felt like an eternity of struggle, as the deluge continued, he managed to free one shoulder, then the other. Using his numb, stiff arms, he slowly pushed himself upward, inch by painful inch, gasping and choking on mud and water. Finally, with a muffled cry that was lost in the storm, he collapsed onto the muddy ground, free. His body was a wreck of pain and bruises, but he was alive. He crawled away from the hole, shivering in the cold rain, and looked up at the grey sky, laughing and crying at the same time. He had been reborn from his own grave. Jedidiah spent the next 2 days in a delirium, stumbling across the now muddy desert. He was a spectre of a man, caked in dried mud, his skin blistered from the sun, his eyes sunken in their sockets. He survived on the few insects he could catch and the lingering water pooled in the rocks. The image of Elara and his rage towards Silas were the only things driving him forward. On the 3rd day, on the verge of death, he collapsed at the base of a rocky butte. It was there he was found by an old gold prospector named Barnaby. Barnaby was a loner who had spent decades talking more to his mule than to other humans. When he saw Jedidiah, he didn't see an outlaw, he saw a tormented soul at death's door. Barnaby carried Jedidiah to his small, hidden shack in a canyon, a place known only to him and the eagles. For the next several weeks, he nursed him back to health. He cleaned his wounds, gave him small amounts of food and water, and spoke to him quietly, not asking for anything, but simply filling the silence. Slowly, Jedidiah's body began to heal, but his soul had been irrevocably altered. The dreaming young man who wanted to buy a ranch was gone. In his place was a silent, hard man whose eyes held the coldness of the desert itself. The scars on his face and neck were a permanent reminder of his ordeal. He was no longer Jedidiah Cain. He was something else, a ghost who had returned from the dead. During his recovery, he said little of his past. But Barnaby, with the wisdom of his solitary years, understood that this man carried a deep and terrible vengeance in his heart. One day, as Jedidiah practiced with Barnaby's old revolver, the old prospector said, "Revenge is a dish best served cold, son. Just make sure you don't freeze along with it." Jedidiah thanked the old man for everything. Barnaby gave him his spare horse, some supplies, and a good pistol. As Jedidiah mounted up, ready to leave, Barnaby asked, "Where you headed?" Jedidiah looked to the horizon where he knew Silas would have gone. His voice was quiet and chilling. "I'm going to hunt some ghosts." Jedidiah wasn't a fool. He knew he couldn't take on 3 experienced gunslingers head-on. He was changed, but he was still one man. So he decided to use the weapon Silas had given him: fear. He tracked the Cain gang's trail from town to town. He heard they had spent lavishly in Tucson, that they'd caused a bloody brawl in a Silver City saloon. He knew that Silas, overconfident, would not have gone far. He would believe Jedidiah had long since decomposed in the desert. Jedidiah found the gang holed up in a half-abandoned mining town called Devil's Gulch. It was the perfect place to lie low, with a sparse population that had learned to mind its own business. He began his psychological war. The first night, he snuck to where their horses were tied and sheared the tail off Dutch's prized stallion. In the morning, when Dutch found it, he was furious, but Silas dismissed it as a prank by some drunk miner. The next night, Jedidiah crept into the room where Snake Eye Sam slept and stole only his right boot. Sam awoke to find one boot missing and felt a chill of dread. There was no sign of a break-in. The whispers began. The suspicious glances. The fear of the unknown began to poison them. The masterstroke came on the 3rd night. Jedidiah waited until Dutch stumbled out of the saloon, blind drunk. He followed him into the dark alleys. He didn't use his gun. He used his hands and a rope. The next morning, the townspeople found Dutch hanging from the saloon sign. And beneath his feet, drawn in the dirt, was a single word: traitor. Panic seized Silas and Sam. They knew this was no work of the locals. A ghost was haunting them. "It's him," Sam shrieked. "He's back. He's come back from the grave." Silas, his pride refusing to believe the impossible, slapped him across the face. "Shut up, you fool. The dead don't come back." But in his own eyes, there was a flicker of terror. That night, Sam was too terrified to sleep. He stayed in the saloon, drinking until the early hours. When he staggered out, Jedidiah was waiting. There was no fight. Sam saw Jedidiah's face in the moonlight. the scars, the dead eyes, and he broke. He fell to his knees, weeping and begging. "You helped dig it," Jedidiah said quietly. "Now you'll know how it feels." He didn't bury him. He left him at the bottom of an old, dry mine shaft with a broken leg and enough water for a single day. He left him to face the same slow horror that he had faced. Now, only Silas remained. Jedidiah found his brother in the saloon, sitting alone at a table with a whiskey bottle and his revolver. When Jedidiah entered, Silas looked up. There was no shock, only a grim, dark acceptance. He finally understood. "So," Silas said, his voice raspy, "the ghosts are real." Jedidiah stood at the other end of the room. "You made this ghost, Silas. I gave you what you deserved. You were weak." "I was human," Jedidiah corrected, "and that's what you could never forgive." Silas stood up slowly, his hand hovering over his gun. "Then let's finish this. Brother against brother. The way it was always meant to be." It wasn't a classic fast-draw duel. It was personal, bitter. As Silas moved, Jedidiah didn't draw his gun. He threw a handful of dirt in his brother's face, the same dirt that had once been his tomb. In that moment of confusion, Jedidiah fired. Not a shot to the heart or the head. A shot to Silas's knee, sending him screaming to the floor. Jedidiah stood over him, his pistol aimed at his face. He saw true fear in his brother's eyes for the first time in his life. "Kill me," Silas begged. "Go on. Do it." Jedidiah looked at the man who was his brother, the man who left him to die. For a moment, he wanted to pull the trigger. But he remembered Barnaby's words, "Just make sure you don't freeze along with it." He lowered his gun. "No," he said softly. "A bullet is too merciful for you. You're going to live. You're going to live with what you did, and with the knowledge that the ghost you created let you live. You will live as a cripple, a broken man, haunted every night by the memory of my face coming out of the dirt." Jedidiah took his share of the gold, and his brother's, and left Silas screaming in pain and humiliation on the saloon floor. Jedidiah never went to Santa Rosa. He knew he was no longer the man Ilara had met. He had seen too much, done too much. The ghost he had become could not live and garden under the sun. Instead, he sent all the gold to her anonymously, with a short, simple note, "For your garden and the ocean. Live the dream for the both of us." Then he turned his horse and rode toward the horizon. He wasn't running from anything, and he wasn't looking for anything. He was simply a man, riding on, carrying his scars and his story. A man who was buried alive in the desert, but was reborn in its fire, becoming a legend whispered on the wind. A true story of the West's most brutal punishment, and of the indomitable human will to survive against death itself. Thank you for watching. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep and fascinating stories from the forgotten pages of history. We'll see you in the next video.